Hi, my name's Rebecca, and today I'm going to be talking about methods of female contraceptives through time and space. So I was interested in the issue of fertility control, as it is truly universal. It transcends time, space, cultures, and as many of the authors point out, women have long been utilizing a variety of methods to control their fertility. I think that this topic also ties in especially well with our two class textbooks written by Horton and Sue, and also Harris and Sue. Specifically, I want to expand on the mind-body connection, which I feel like was closely tied to traditional methods of contraceptives, which is a point emphasized by both authors Horton and Sue and Harris and Sue. And I also want to expand on the notion of the four humors in relation to contraceptives, which is a notion brought up by Horton and Sue. So firstly, before moving on, I want to go over the three areas I want to cover in this seminar. So the first area I'm going to look at is Green and Finch, who describe a number of natural contraceptive methods from their initial conception to their modern adaptations by the biomedical world. Secondly, Green and Finch neglect to mention any of the motivations their users may have had in choosing natural products and how these perceptions may have changed with the introduction of chemical birth control, hormonal birth control products. So I'm going to look at Kolbitz, who will examine how natural methods were pushed out of women's consciousness by the biomedical world. Because overall, my argument is that the creation of birth control has lowered the status of traditional forms of birth control, which may be more culturally and practically appropriate and equally efficient in limiting fertility. To emphasize this point, I'm going to look at a case study where many women show hesitancy towards modern forms of hormonal, chemical methods of birth control. And I'm going to go over the reasons why they hold these hesitancies. But before moving on, I want to go back to the four humors, which I mentioned earlier, and their relationship to fertility control. As Horton and Sue describe, there are four main humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Obviously, blood is crucially tied to women's health, and it serves as a tool to evaluate one's sexual health and to determine pregnancy. So women have long been seeking to alter the humor of blood in their body for a variety of reasons, for example, to regulate or prompt menstruation or to induce abortion. And interestingly, another thing that Kolbitz points out, which I want to mention briefly here, is that abortion is culturally subjective, and it has been historically. In many cultures, it is seen as unclean to be lacking one's menstruation, so many women would use these traditional herbal methods to prompt their menstruation, which would in turn sometimes induce abortion inadvertently. And also, interestingly, another thing she points out is that at one point abortions were commonplace. They didn't have all these connotations surrounding them that they do now, which is interesting and something to keep in mind with this topic. But also, I want to cover sperm because, as Horton and Sue mentioned, sperm is also an important tool in evaluating health. It's also crucial to the reproductive process. Therefore, it's consequentially tied to women's health. Even though it is not necessarily produced by women, it also falls under the responsibility of women. Interestingly, with this topic in general, it's interesting because women are really only fertile a very limited period of the time, whereas men are fertile all the time, but this responsibility still falls under women, which is interesting. Moving on. So as I mentioned, I want to talk about Green and Finch's book, Contraception Through the Ages. So in their book, they mention a range of contraceptive methods. I'm only going to look at a few, which I feel are particularly connected to the mind-body connection, or particularly tied to women's health. Yeah. So to start off, I want to talk about pessaries. So, pessaries are defined as a mixture which would be inserted to the vagina prior to sex. The first and oldest pessary rose in ancient Egypt and was made by mixing crocodile dung with a glue-like substance, honey, for example. The mixture's ingredients did not chemically provide any qualities to prevent against pregnancy, but rather it was the clogging effect that the combination of these ingredients provided, which decreased the likelihood of pregnancy. And this method must have proved to have been reliable for many years. It was used for nearly 3,000 years and reappeared in the Islamic world in the 11th century, but then mysteriously disappeared from that point on. So interestingly, with this pessary, one might ask how did this seemingly unattractive method persist for so long? And the answer does lie in the mind-body connection, in that crocodiles played an important role in Egyptian mythology and medical works. Crocodile dung possessed qualities related to increasing strength and personal strength and religious attachment. So overall, this pessary was really culturally relevant for these people. They believed in it, which is why it persisted for the time that it did. Moving on from that, Serenus of Ephesus put his own spin on the pessary by insisting that any oily substance could be mixed with another fleshy substance like pomegranate pulp or the inside of a fig, and this could be made into a pessary. By the year 527 AD, the pessary was being widely used and was noted in nearly every medical textbook of the time. As pessary's popularity grew, these spread further west, and many countries put their own spin on the pessary. At the end of the 10th century, a Persian physician named Ali ibn Abbas changed the pessary forever by adding an active spermicide. So he chose rock salt and a mixture of an oily substance. Regular table salt is an excellent spermicide. So rock salt possesses its quality to an even greater degree. So this was a really effective method that he came up with. Another interesting point that I think we talked about in class quite a bit was the notion of primitive people being able to develop systems of medicine which were really effective for the time, based with reference to their limited knowledge of science. So Green and Finch elaborate on this point by noting that even primitive people were able to develop effective pessaries. The Akanisi, a group of Indonesian people in the island of Sumatra, created a pessary which was made from local plants and contained a high percentage of tannic acid. Tannic acid has proven to be an effective spermicide. And this draws us back to the notion that society is completely ignorant of literature regarding medicine, have come to develop really effective methods. So, in the 18th century, Walter Randell would make his first step to bring the pessary out from the shadows and into the modern world. So, Randell was a chemist who owned his own pharmacy, and he was particularly attentive to the needs of his patients. So, he found that women were needing a contraceptive, so he came up with quinine, which he found would exceptionally exceed his expectations in regards to preventing pregnancy. And at the same time, Annie Besant, who was a great pioneer of birth control in the birth control movement, came onto the scene. She also endorsed Randell's product, which further increased its popularity. By 1886, the product's success prompted Randell to market his product commercially. Soon demand grew so high that large-scale production was required, and by the turn of the century, Randell's pessary was being sold worldwide. So overall, what's important, here's Randell's pessary. Overall, what is important in the evolution of the modern pessary is that it shares much of the same characteristics of the traditional pessary. What has changed here is the mind-body connection, which has been lost in the evaluation of deciding whether these methods are effective or not. I argue that, as Sue and Harris suggest in their introductory chapters of their book, that indigenous methods are often ignored and devalued by Western scientists. Previously, pessaries were deemed to be successful due to their cultural relevancy, and that the components in these methods were deemed to have inherent powers, but today the accuracy is based on chemical tests, and consequentially, this has created a mind-body dualism in regards to how women view contraception. Okay, moving on to the next chapter. It covers douching and fumigation. So Green and Finch describe that douching can be traced back to Egypt. It was used, it was approved of. Fumigation also usually was a combination of these two. One would follow the other. Early douches were advised from 1500 BC and consisted of wine and garlic, and these were used after sex. Many accounts of fumigation and douching appear in Indian medical textbooks, but the method of passing some sort of spermicidal gas into the vagina has lasted nearly 2,000 years. In Eastern Europe, this method is still used to prompt women's menstruation. Modern techniques have simply simplified this method by the introduction of tablets, which I've put down there. The gases produced by these tablets are either oxygen or carbon dioxide, and these gases freely clean the vagina. And after sex, one is advised to use a douching solution. Interestingly, this process is nearly identical to the one recorded by Petrie in the Petrie papyrus from 2,000 years ago. Again, here's a notion that primitive people, also in this method, were able to develop really effective methods despite their lack of knowledge on the science that we have now. So Green and Finch give the example of Negro women of Martinique who prepared a solution which was extremely effective in preventing pregnancy. Their solution included mahogany tusks, which is a powerful astringent, in lemon juice, which would serve as a spermicide. In comparison to other methods, this method did not maintain its popularity, and Green and Finch note that this method is extremely demanding. Perhaps it was too much to ask women to leave the warmth of their bed post-sex to walk in the winter cold from one room to another and prepare a cold douche. Also, the poor would find these instructions nearly impossible due to the confined spaces of their homes. Women who were wealthy likely would have maids who would help them with this process, so it was likely an effective method for them, but not for many other people. Returning to Annie Besant, she also endorsed the douche as an effective method, but also acknowledged that it was not really practical or feasible for all women. So in comparison to many other methods that I'm going to explore and have just explored, this method has a significant amount of opposition, which brings up the question of why it lasted so long. In a large part, it survived due to the commercial interest which was surrounding the area of contraceptives. Douching reached its peak during the 1930s and had ads everywhere. But as other methods became more accessible, this method declined, and arguably it has run its course as it's an extremely, extremely unpopular method now. It's generally regarded, I would say, as unhealthy. So, yeah, arguably, this method has truly run its course. So another method that was described by Green and Finch was balls, feathers, and caps. So the introduced this chapter by talking about Casanova, who described how he would insert a small gold ball into the vagina prior to sex. Interestingly, this method goes back to 1500 BC in the Ebers of Papyrus, in which a tampon soaked in honey and acacia is described to prevent pregnancy. There's also evidence in India and Asia that plugging the vagina with small balls or wads of feathers was also not uncommon. Ancient Talmudists realized that an effective blocking mechanism was a sponge, which grew in their local waters. Interestingly, the sponge method has persisted till now and has generally gone almost unchanged. Overall, the Talmudists proved that they were extremely ahead of their time with this invention, as it proved to be extremely practical and efficient. Chinese and Japanese women historically used a very silky piece of paper which was placed against the cervix to prevent pregnancy. Russian women used beeswax and melted it down into discs, which would cover the cervix, as beeswax does not melt at our body temperatures. And overall, all these methods share qualities similar to the modern-day rubber cap, but this would not be invented until 1838. An additional method is described by an Arabian physician, which was to take the right testicle of a wolf, rub it with oil, wrap it in wool, and insert it into the vagina. And the idea behind this was it would cause her to lose desire and would lessen her chances of conception. In relation to the mind-body connection, fertility and passivity are qualities which are seen as opposing. Therefore, to render a woman passive is to make her less likely to conceive. Alright, so coughs and sneezes are another topic that is outlined by Green and Finch. They describe that there is great powers associated with jumping, coughing, sneezing, and that these were all deemed to solve the problem of fertility. Going back to the notion of passivity affecting fertility, which I just mentioned, Chinese philosophers believed a woman could avoid pregnancy by adopting a completely passive attitude during sex. This notion that women could control fertility through their emotions had originated from very early times, and interestingly, this is also something that we covered in class, the notion of Chinese medicine and their medical system and the tie to emotions, and that producing health effects, which I think is really interesting. In addition to this, the notion of passivity is also mentioned by H. Ploss in 1887. He mentions that women of Beru Island maintained absolute passivity when engaging in sex with strange men, as to avoid pregnancy. This notion, interestingly, even spread to Victorian England, where women believed that it was evil to enjoy sex and that this led to pregnancy, and that passivity would decrease one's likelihood of becoming pregnant. So overall, as I just mentioned with the whole mind-body connection thing, I think that it's interesting that this also affected Victorian England, because generally in class we didn't look at how emotions were viewed as affecting women's health, but here in Victorian England is a clear example of how they're describing that emotion can affect women's health. So in addition to this, Green and Finch state that passivity may be effective as it could cause sperm to be contained in the vagina for longer, where sperm would be immobilized by natural acidic secretions. Also, the reason that they mention for coughs and sneezes were likely to produce some sort of anti-pregnancy reaction was simply due to the body during coughing and sneezing. There's likely, if there's substance within the body, it's likely to come out. Therefore, women would excrete the sperm from their vagina, making them less likely to become pregnant, which was likely the reasoning behind this method. Lastly, the last chapter that I'm going to cover by Green and Finch is folklore. So Lucretius believed that conception could be prevented by eating certain types of food, which is something that we talked about in class. Horton and Sue describe the relationship between food and health. Interestingly, it's also relevant here. Dioscorides stated that women should wear asparagus as an amulet to prevent pregnancy. Other methods of wearing included wearing portions of animals suspended around the body. Indian women favored amulets and tied a large piece of root of the datura plant around the waist. Russian women believed in a spell which would make them infertile until the witch would revert the spell. Another Russian superstition for preventing pregnancy included collecting the egg of a young hen, puncturing a hole in the egg, placing menstrual blood in the egg, burning the hole underneath the floor. 9 days later, going back to get the egg. The amount of worms that were in the egg would dictate the amount of children one were to have, unless this woman were to take the egg and throw it in the fire right away, then she wouldn't have any children. Spreading menstrual blood all over the body is also seen as a way of preventing pregnancy. In Central Europe, women would wear the longest finger of their stillborn, and when she were to mount a horse, she would place the finger underneath the saddle, and she would be fertile for a year. Green and Finch state that it was not uncommon to prevent birth by relying on the dead. Many superstitions surrounding contraception are allied with the dead. Similarly, in medieval France, women would hang the anus and the finger of a dead fetus as to avoid pregnancy. Bosnian women would shake the coffins of their deceased children and repeat that they wished no more children, and the desired result would occur. In Nordic countries like Scandinavia and Greenland, women relied more heavily on magical methods such as rotating mills backwards as to induce abortion, or putting a knife in the ceiling of the bedroom as to prevent pregnancy. Interestingly, we can see how many of these folkloric tales are tied back to notions made by Horton and Sioux, and how methods of medicine have varied through time, space, but overall many of these methods somehow proved to be reliable in many ways, and how many were often more focused on the mind-body connection. So now I want to talk about Colbit's, because as we have seen from Green and Finch, European women have obviously had a lot of understanding towards natural contraceptives, but somehow this knowledge was lost, corrupted, and devalued. In other places of the world, this knowledge stuck around until the 20th century, but by the end of the 20th century, many of this knowledge was lost, and many women fell mercy to westernized medical professionals. Colbit's argues that North American and European women have grown ignorant of the range of herbal methods used for contraception, and during the 70s, there was a movement to revive these methods, but unfortunately, some women died as a result of taking too much pennyroyal. Industrialization has had a huge impact on family planning, as argued by Colbit's. Children were once seen as an asset to a more agricultural-based life, but now they are more of economic liabilities. In addition to this, Colbit's argues that industrialization degraded the knowledge surrounding natural methods of contraception. Colbit's wants to emphasize that industrialization did not bring up the emergence of birth control. It was a problem long before this. Simply, industrialization brought this issue to light, and people started seeing this more as a social problem, not so much as an individual problem. So it prompted new types of birth control. At the same time, male physicians were trying to gain control over midwives and over female practitioners, and male physicians worked extremely hard from discouraging women from seeing these midwives and female practitioners, and also sought to limit midwives' ability to access their traditional tools. Colbit's notes that many natural herbs were replaced with harmful products. Lysol claimed to be especially great because it would be gentle on the membranes but yet effective. But one thing that we need to consider at this time, which also affected women's access to natural birth controls, is overall women's limited access to birth control in general. At this time, there was, and throughout time, there has been a lot of criticism around women's access to birth control for religious reasons, or whether that be political reasons. There's been a lot of dispute over this, which has, as I said, limited women's access to birth control. So as this general limit to birth control has existed, there has also consequentially been this limit to natural birth controls. So as there was this pushing out of birth controls in general, natural birth controls simply got pushed out even further. Okay, so moving on to our case study by Agajanian. He looks at the use of contraceptives in urban Mozambique. So he claims that Western science rarely addresses indigenous methods, However, scientifically, indigenous methods are likely equally as sound as our modern chemical hormonal methods that we use today. So the use of he uses qualitative data to analyze women's choice between modern use of birth control and traditional forms of birth control. He refers to them as indigenous. It's also noteworthy that indigenous methods were equally popular in rural areas as they were in urban areas. So this is not an issue that is reserved for women in rural areas. So what he found in his results were that city women are more likely to use indigenous methods, which is interesting because one would think that it would be the opposite. One would think that women in the city would have less ties to their cultural roots, therefore they would be more prompted to use chemical, hormonal, biomedical, modern forms of birth control. But this is simply not the case. So, and it's because when women move to the city, the issue of fertility control becomes more prevalent. They realize that it may not be feasible to raise as many children in the city as it would be to raise as many children in a rural area. So just because of this, they started thinking of contraception more. They're more likely to turn to indigenous methods. Something that authors often bring up, as I saw in a lot of the readings that I was looking at in reference to natural forms of birth control, is that these forms of birth control that are natural are extremely they're likely to fail, which is interesting because this author says women in Mozambique do know this. They also know that Western forms of medication also fail, which is interesting because that's something that I never saw pointed out by any other authors, is that modern contraceptives are also equal to fail. And that generally women see less of a risk in taking indigenous forms of birth control because they are particularly concerned about IUDs and Depo-Vera because they have the potential to create long-term sterility, and women in this culture are really worried about that. They have all these fears about the effects surrounding birth control, especially, as I just mentioned, Depo-Vera, which is really common here, and IUDs. So they would rather go with a indigenous method. In addition to this, indigenous methods almost have no side effects. So women simply just see this as a better option. In addition to this, privacy is another reason why women seek out indigenous methods opposed to biomedical methods. To acquire a biomedical method of contraception, women need to go to clinics, and clinics are busy, and there's a lot of people, and a lot of women in this culture respect their own privacy, so they would rather go to a natural healer than go to a clinic and see a doctor. And also the cost of indigenous methods are way less than modern methods of contraception, which is appealing also for women because they don't have to spend as much money. So overall, what Agajanian found was that indigenous methods are more culturally and practically appropriate, which is why women in urban Mozambique seem to still go for indigenous methods of birth control rather than modern forms. Alright, so in conclusion, what I said at the start of my essay seminar was that my main argument was that modern contraceptives have devalued the importance and use of natural contraceptives, and that natural contraceptives are really heavily tied to the mind-body connection and for humors, which generally just makes them more culturally appropriate and more practical. So overall, it seems as though we should spend some time looking into more natural methods of birth control rather than these hormonal and chemical types of birth controls, as natural methods would suit a wider range of people and also would likely produce less harmful effects, and also brings back this mind-body connection into the contraceptive world, as I've explained, that the chemical biomedical world emphasizes mind-body dualism in relation to contraceptives. These other forms tie the body and the mind together, which is interesting. And yeah. So overall, basically, what I'm trying to say is that the mind-body connection, I don't know.